Very interesting. I mean, we talk about in psychology something similar to that. We say when there's bias, it gets amplified. The more it goes like through person after person, it just gets amplified, right? So you'll hear a story, and then if somebody has any bias, by the time it gets to the 10th person, it's like a completely different story. But, when it comes to things like human rights, which I know that's where a lot of your work centers around, when you look at cultural translation in the lens of human rights, like what is that? Like when you because I would think that human rights would be the same, like pretty universal, right? But it's not. We see that in a lot of different countries. So how is it translated culture by culture, and how is it different?
Absolutely. And there is human rights by definition is an idea that aims to be universal. So they are defined, like human rights can be a set of legal documents, a set of political stances, a political movement, but also fundamentally it's an idea that everyone inherently has value and rights just because they're an individual. And so the interesting thing about human rights is that how that idea then is applied in different places, again, varies not just because there is, as you say, this bias where it becomes the narrative is transformed as it moves through one particular network. But there are many different translators and many different people reinterpreting human rights in different ways. So my research focuses mostly on children's rights and things like violence against children or child labor and what kind of activism exists trying to prevent those harmful practices. And what's really interesting is that you see a lot of people with great intentions who are trying to get out there and help kids around the world and protect them from work. But the people who are drafting these international conventions and creating these international campaigns are in one part of the world, and then they work with different intermediaries and different allies and partners in different parts of the world, and that gets translated into different local policies and national campaigns, and that in turn is applied in different ways in specific communities around the world. And almost unavoidably, the goal, the expectations, the priorities kind of shift through this movement. So even though everyone is saying like, oh, we're all part of the global fight against child labor, to give you like one really small example, in the international arena, a lot of people are focusing on like, okay, what are the causes of child labor? How do we define child labor? How do we draw the line between acceptable child work and unacceptable child labor? And then you see that through this long chain of people may slightly disagree with those things or may slightly blur the line between those two activities, and things get lost in translation. And you get things like a well-intentioned campaign inadvertently stigmatizing children in a very specific sense. So to give you just one example, there was this huge campaign in the 90s against sweatshops in Bangladesh because it was a very common practice and people wanted to boycott products that were created in sweatshops. And this was very effective. There was a lot of shaming campaigns going on that closed down these sweatshops. But what got lost in translation was that people were only looking at one part of the problem, at the demand side of the problem. And they didn't realize that those kids didn't have anywhere else to go. It's not they boycotted the sweatshops, they closed down these factories, but what happened with the kids? There was a study that happened a year later and found that a lot of these kids were still living on the streets, were in more dangerous occupations, had not necessarily gone back to school. So what you see is that even though in the global arena, in the international conventions, in the different conference rooms where people and advocates are getting together trying to fight child labor, they had all of these aims. That aim was kind of diluted in the process of being applied in the local context. And weirdly, a lot of kids fell through the cracks. And so that's what I'm really interested in how this idea of human rights works in theory versus in practice, and how can we make sure that those align as much as possible.
Very interesting. And I know you're writing about something that caught my eye, which is good intentions, unforeseen outcomes, right? Exactly. And so we talk about that in psychology, like good intentions, and then sometimes they have bad outcomes, right? Now, I can imagine there are a lot of different barriers when it comes to cultural translation. Like you have like the language barrier, you have the money barrier, you have like barriers around morality. And so for some countries, it's okay for kids to work. In other countries, it's not, right? So how are they doing business? How are they getting around that, right? So I know that the United States will outsource to different countries that let children work for pennies a day, right? Because those countries, they allow that, but we don't allow that in the United States, so we go around it. But when we talk about good intentions and unforeseen outcomes, okay, so can you explain a little bit more about that? Maybe like what you're writing about, maybe like a preview of the book or something?
Absolutely. So I'm focusing specifically on campaigns against child labor because there was this article I ran into in Bolivia a few years ago. There was this march. A lot of children who were in child labor came out and marched on the streets and marched towards the presidential palace in La Paz. But weirdly, they were protesting for what they called their right to work with dignity, which was very striking to me because A, it goes against everything we assume about children. We assume that kids are apolitical, that they're not choosing to work. And most of the time, to be fair, they're not. They are being forced to work because of extreme poverty or inequalities or lack of access to services. But these kids were demanding the right to work. And what was striking wasn't just that they were going against kind of the global idea of what children should be doing and going against the global campaigns, but they were doing so in the language of human rights. They were calling it a right to work. They were framing it in this very international way. So that's kind of what got me started in this research. And what I found was precisely what you're talking about, this idea that these very good intentions are creating these unforeseen outcomes, which in the case of the working children in Bolivia, kids were being stigmatized when people wanted to actually protect them. So there was something going on in the campaign, something was being lost in translation, that what is a campaign that is explicitly about protecting the dignity, potential, and childhood of children was weirdly making children feel attacked and making them feel stigmatized and worse off because of it. So I really wanted to understand where this was happening, what had gone wrong in that process. And what's interesting is that a lot of times when I talk to people about my research on child labor, they will frame it almost like a global versus local debate. So there are all of these global ideas, but in the local context, there's, as you say, there's a different culture. Okay, let me backtrack. As you say, in the local context, there may be a different cultural assumptions about childhood or child labor. There are different economic realities. There are different, as you say, language barriers. In Spanish, the term is trabajo infantil, but in English, we have two terms, child work and child labor. Child work we usually assume is something that's acceptable, that's good for kids. So think of like a kid with a paper route or having a lemonade stand or all of those archetypical images of working children, as opposed to child labor, which we assume is bad because it's wrong for children to work, of course, in factories, in large-scale agriculture, in mines, and things like that. But in Spanish, there's only one term for both, so there's a lot more conceptual slippage between the two. We don't have a different word for work and for labor, and that makes it very difficult when we are implementing these campaigns. And at the same time, you're absolutely right. There are just different economic realities, there are different cultural assumptions about childhood. So a lot of times people frame this as kind of like the global universalistic human rights perspective versus the local traditional culture. But when you pay closer attention to what the kids are actually saying, they're still framing it in terms of rights. They're still talking about these in very explicitly moral terms. And what I found is that it's not just that there's something quote unquote backwards about the local culture that is making people defend child labor. It is something about the campaign itself that they're not realizing that they are causing this resistance. They're not realizing that in the campaign, something is getting lost in translation. So just to give one example, the people who are starting these campaigns in UNICEF, in the International Labor Organization, they're always very careful to talk about what causes child labor, and they talk about these structural issues and inequalities. They never want to blame parents because they say parents don't want to send their kids to work. It's because of these conditions in which they find themselves that they can't help it. That's kind of the broader narrative that they're telling. But when I started interviewing people in local governments, in local NGOs, and providing direct services to families and children, a lot of them kind of shifted that story and did start blaming parents and made it less about structural inequalities and more about individual flaws. So they would say things like, oh, the parents are lazy, the parents are sending their kids to work because they don't want to work, the parents are bad parents, basically. And so you see how the message moves from this international arena into the regional, national, and local spaces and starts changing. And that inadvertently makes children feel attacked rather than protected and pushes a lot of them into these movements that defend child labor. So the story is being lost in translation, and that is kind of creating this problem that nobody intended to create, if that makes sense.